Sophocles' Greek tragedy, Oedipus Rex, we read that Laius and Jocasta, the king and queen of Thebes, had a baby, and Laius went to the oracle at Delphi to ask about it. The oracle told Laius that his son would murder him. Horrified, Laius ordered that his baby son should be exposed in the woods with a pin through his feet to keep him from crawling away. But the baby was rescued and taken to the king and queen of Corinth, who wanted a son and couldn't have one, so they adopted him. The queen of Corinth called the baby Oedipus, which means swollen foot, on account of the pin through his foot. The intended infant death is presented matter-of-factly in this very popular work of the time, without revulsion, reflecting the ethics of that particular time. W.V. Harris states in Child Exposure in the Roman Empire, in the Journal of Roman Studies, the following, quotes, "It was much the commonest, though not the only way in which infants were killed, and in many, perhaps most regions, it was a familiar phenomenon," end quotes. Similar to Greek plays in ancient times, movies both reflect and shape our values in our own times today. According to Martin Pernick, a movie entitled The Black Stork, S-T-O-R-K, was shown commercially in American movie theaters from 1916 through the 1920s after 1918 under the name Are You Fit to Marry? It was slightly revised and re-released in 1927, and though no soundtrack was added, it continued to be shown in movie theaters throughout the United States, small theaters traveling around the United States up until 1942. The Black Stork is loosely based on the events surrounding the 1915 delivery by Dr. Harry Hazelden of baby Bollinger, a newborn with multiple physical anomalies, and this is a newspaper story about that particular event. Dr. Hazelden concluded that surgery could correct the baby's life-threatening intestinal defects and thus save the baby's life, but that gross physical and mental deformities would remain. He urged the parents not to request the operation. The Bollingers agreed, and 5 days later, the baby died. Dr. Hazelden revealed that he had secretly permitted many other infants he diagnosed as defectives to die during the decade before 1915, becoming the first Western physician in modern times to publicly admit and permit the death of a potentially salvageable newborn. Reflecting his own times, Dr. Hazelden was neither the first to openly advocate euthanasia of newborns with multiple congenital defects, nor was the Black Stork, and here is a poster from that particular movie, in which, by the way, Dr. Hazelden stars as a fictionalized version of himself, and here you can see him in the movie turning away the nurse who wants to take the child for an operation. And this was not the first film, actually, The Black Stork, to promote eugenics. According to Professor Pernick again, quotes, "Dozens of films depicted eugenics and heredity before the rise of aesthetic censorship, and anti-eugenic farces began as early as 1904 with titles such as Thomas Edison's The Strenuous Life or Anti-Race Suicide, Eugenics at the Bar U Ranch, Snakesville Eugenic Marriage, and Would Be Wed and the Microbes." In 1920, German jurist Karl Bindig and psychiatrist Dr. Alfred Hoche wrote their infamous and influential book, Allowing the Destruction of Lives Not Worth Living, using a term reminiscent of Dr. Hazelden's Lives of No Value. Germany both feared that it would be left behind by a eugenic race with America and simultaneously admired Americans as leaders in the application of eugenic theory to public policy. So, while American filmmakers shunned the issue of eugenics in the 1920s, German filmmakers developed their own eugenic films with titles such as The Curse of Heredity, Survival of the Fittest, and The Enemy in the Blood. In his book, Medical Films, Ethics, and Euthanasia in Nazi Germany, Professor Ulf Schmidt states, quotes, after the seizure of power by Adolf Hitler in January 1933, the new regime immediately started to mold and transform the whole educational structure according to Nazi ideological aims. He goes on to quote a leading Nazi bureaucrat who said, quotes, propaganda as a means of coordinating the purposeful ambitions of a people naturally has to be designed for the masses because it cannot do without the instrument of suggestion. Propaganda for a small number of people is a contradiction in terms. Film as a product of the most modern technique, with its unlimited possibilities of copying, is by nature aimed at the masses, end quotes. Perhaps the most famous of the Nazi propaganda films was Triumph of the Will by German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. Hitler commissioned the film, served as its executive producer, and his name appears in the opening credits. Triumph of the Will glorifies Hitler as the true German leader who restored Germany to a world power. German films about eugenics and their filmmakers may not be as well known as Triumph of the Will and Leni Riefenstahl, but they were equally effective. Some films encouraged positive eugenics, or a healthy lifestyle, excluding cigarettes and including exercise and a healthy diet, and procreation by the fit. Other films propagandizing negative eugenics, especially sterilization and euthanasia, were promoted even more vigorously. These films bore titles such as What You Inherit, Victims of the Past, All Life is Struggle, The Inheritance, Existence Without Life, Mentally Ill, and I Accuse. This last film is one of several featured in the Michael Burleigh documentary Selling Murder that is playing continuously in the museum's exhibit here. How Healing Became Killing, Eugenics, Euthanasia, and Extermination is the name of the exhibit here, and Selling Murder is a central feature of that exhibit. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Glen Gabbard, will use Selling Murder in his presentation entitled Cinematic Perspectives on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide. To my mind, there is no one more qualified to discuss this topic than Dr. Gabbard, who is Brown Foundation Chair of Psychoanalysis and Professor of Psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine right here in Houston. He is also Director of Psychotherapy Education and Director of the Baylor Psychiatric Clinic. Dr. Gabbard is a training and supervising analyst at the Houston Galveston Psychoanalytic Institute and Associate Editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry. He has published over 250 scientific papers and book chapters, and has also authored or edited 19 books, including Psychodynamic Psychiatry and Clinical Practice, 4th edition, which has been an all-time bestseller at American Psychiatric Publishing. He is editor-in-chief of Gabbard's Treatment of Psychiatric Disorders, 4th edition. You seem to like 4th editions. Dr. Gabbard has also served as associate editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association and as joint editor-in-chief and editor for North America of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He has received numerous awards, including the 2004 American Psychiatric Association Adolph Meyer Award, the 2000 Mary S. Sigourney Award for Outstanding Contributions to Psychoanalysis, the 1997 Charles Burlingham Award of the Institute of Living, and the 1994 Edward A. Strecker Award of the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital. He lectures widely in Europe, South America, and Australia. In addition to his outstanding contributions to the field of psychiatry, Dr. Gabbard has edited Psychoanalysis and Film, a collection of essays by leading international psychoanalysts exploring film as a dominant expression of contemporary culture and its reflection of universal myths and contemporary anxiety. He has also published 2 other books on film and television, Psychiatry and the Cinema, written with his brother Corinne Gabbard, and my personal favorite, The Psychology of the Sopranos, Love, Death, Desire, and Betrayal in America's Favorite Gangster Family. So, If you think you will have anything less than a most enjoyable and informative evening, forget about it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gabbard.
Thank you, Shelley, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. And I also want to thank the Holocaust Museum and all of its staff for putting in all the effort to make this whole series possible. I am going to talk about the cinema tonight, and you know, in his introduction, Dr. Rubenfeld talked about Greek tragedy, and I would say that today the cinema is the great storehouse of images and myths that, like the Greek tragedies did for the citizens of Athens many years ago, the cinema joins the audience with its culture. And it's a way of uniting audiences with certain familiar cinematic narratives that become mythological in their dimensions. And it can be argued, I think, that the cinema not only reflects culture, but it creates culture and creates reality. There's the old New Yorker cartoon of the guy walking out of the Bogart film who slaps the usher as he walks out. And again, this guy is saying, okay, this is what you're supposed to do. You rough people up. I learned this from the movies. And I think there's a naivete anytime we say that, audiences can make distinctions between reality and what's on the great silver screen. Audiences aren't fooled. Well, that's bunk. Madison Avenue is known for years that people are tremendously persuaded by images they see on television. And, we now as a culture have a whole set of schema in our memory banks, all from the cinema. The whore with the heart of gold, the laconic cowboy, the corrupt policeman, the socially inept intellectual. These are all stereotypes and schema that we carry around with us. And, advertisers have known that this is how you sell anything from toothpaste to political candidates, by getting, something in the media and making sure that people get to see it. Now, it goes beyond that to the point where gender and sex role stereotypes are tremendously influenced by the media. In the 50s, Marilyn Monroe taught women how to be women. John Wayne taught men how to be men. This was what was expected. Now, how many of you in this audience remember the huge box office hit in 1986 starring Tom Cruise called Top Gun? Okay? The Village Voice referred to this as Phallus in Wonderland. And of course, it's a totally preposterous film about Navy pilots, and you may remember that Tom Cruise sat in classes with a glamorous PhD astrophysicist portrayed by Kelly McGillis, your typical astrophysicist. And no matter how preposterous this was, the applications for the Navy's pilot program dramatically increased after this film opened. Audiences didn't make a distinction between what was real and what was, purely cinematic fiction. They accepted as that's what it's like. So this is the power of the film as a medium that Nazi Germany appropriated when, they were starting to think, how can we get the word out? How can we make the kind of killing that we're going to promote palatable? Well, they had a series of films about eugenics, heredity, and euthanasia that Dr. Rubenfeld mentioned, and they were deliberately intended to promote an accepting attitude towards the necessity of killing in the Third Reich's master plan. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is show you some clips, and I'm going to illustrate some parallels between Nazi propaganda films and the way that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is portrayed in more contemporary commercial films. In brief, the parallels are disconcerting. In the last 20 years, a lot of these films from the Nazi Germany era of the 30s and 40s have been unearthed. They were previously not available. And there is a, let me go to a slide here. There is quite a historical documentation now of these films that we didn't have before. These are propaganda films of the RWU, which stands for Reich Institute for Film and Images in Science and Education. And the purpose was clearly to politicize the educational film and make all of these things acceptable, like sterilization, euthanasia, eugenics. And it's now clear that Hitler introduced a state-controlled educational film policy. And the officials of the RWU had considerable power. In fact, they coerced academics and professors to show these films in the classroom. And some of the examples are The Curse of Heredity, 1927, Laws of Heredity, 1935. They focused very deliberately on the physically and mentally disabled, and they stigmatized these groups by claiming that this was not natural. This defied natural law to let these people survive. Now, many of these films would promote sterilization, and there would be sweeping claims like, for example, the second bullet point, 1 in 4 people would ultimately be hereditarily ill. They came up with statistics that we have no idea, where they derive from, but they were very powerfully portrayed in these films, and they use cinematic technique quite effectively. For example, the need to kill the weak and the disabled would get presented with numerous examples in nature of, an eagle grabbing a rabbit, and then they would have stirring images of healthy German youth juxtaposed to weak, mentally and physically disabled people, showing that there was a clear rationale for this kind of euthanasia. One of the films that is perhaps one of the most creepy that I saw is Existence Without Life. Now this was finished in 1941, and they have an actor playing a professor to lend credibility to this. Now, he's giving a lecture in a classroom to a bunch of healthy-looking German youth, and he's identifying mental illness as a hereditary evil. Now, there are numerous shots here of grotesque faces which they light in a certain way to make them look even more grotesque, to make the argument that these people are really not truly human and would be better off dead. The professor has a kind of authority that lends all of his statements a kind of gravitas that is very compelling, and you'll see I'm going to show you a clip. And he ends the film with a powerful personal comment in which he states with great emotion that if he were afflicted with mental illness like these people, he would do anything to prevent it. He goes on to say that he would rather die than have this mental illness that is depicted in the film. Now, the professor then suggests that we really have an obligation to allow these mentally ill people to exercise their rights, because there's no doubt that, like him, they would prefer to be dead. And he even quotes a poll, which you'll see, where 73% of parents said they would want their child to be killed if he or she had this kind of incurable illness. Now, what I'm going to do now is show you a clip of this film and some pretty ghastly things in it, as you'll see.
The professor then appropriates the religious language of mercy and salvation to call for the killing of disabled people. The asylum's administrators had been instructed to choose what they called hopeless cases, many of whom were given a temporary reprieve from the gas chambers to be filmed.
Wir rufen ein gnädiges Schicksal an, diese bedauernswerten Geschöpfe von ihrem Dasein ohne Leben zu befreien. Wie grenzenlos grausam ist es, die geistig Toten als lebende Leichname bis in ein hohes Alter zu konservieren. Tag ein, Tag aus, in der Nacht des Wahnsinns. Immer die gleichen irren Ideen, immer dasselbe idiotische Gebaren. Jahre, Jahrzehnte, ein Menschenalter lang. Dauerzustand auf einem Niveau, das wir erst tief unten in der Tierreihe wiederfinden.
Arriving at the crux of the argument, the film switches to a deeply emotional and personal tone to confuse the issue of the state coldly carrying out mass murder.
Gestatten Sie mir, mit einer rein menschlichen und durchaus persönlichen Schlussbemerkung über den Rahmen dieser Vorlesung hinauszugehen. Wenn ich wüsste, dass mich, und diese Gefahr kann für jeden bestehen, das Unglück einer unheilbaren Geisteskrankheit träfe, dass mir ein solches Dasein ohne Leben bevorstünde, ich würde alles tun, um diesen Fall nicht zu erleben. Ich würde lieber sterben. Ich bin überzeugt, alle Gesunden denken so. Aber ich bin auch überzeugt, dass jeder unheilbar Geisteskranke oder Idiot, wenn er seinen Zustand erkennen könnte, einem solchen Dasein das Ende vorziehen würde. Kein vernünftiger Mensch wird ihm dieses Recht auf den Tod absprechen können. Ist das nicht die Pflicht derer, die es angeht, den Unmündigen, und das sind die Vollidioten und unheilbar Geisteskranken, zu ihrem Recht zu verhelfen? Ist das nicht heilige Forderung der Barmherzigkeit? Erlöst, die ihr nicht heilen könnt. Diese Frage richtete der Direktor einer großen Irrenanstalt an die Eltern seiner unheilbaren Pfleglinge. 73% antworteten mit Ja. Eine Mutter schrieb, nicht fragen, handeln.
Now, as you can see, there's something about cinematic images, the medium, that makes a much more powerful and emotional and persuasive statement and argument than the written word. And seeing this on a film is going to persuade people to think this makes sense, this is a rational argument, far better than reading some kind of rational statement in a book. And the Nazis knew this and took advantage of it. And in this particular film that you just saw, I Accuse, excuse me, that was Existence Without Life. I'm going to show you the I Accuse clip later. But in this film, which was from 1941, something incredibly significant happens in this film. They take a situation of voluntary euthanasia, and what they do is they conflate it with the idea of state-sanctioned mass murder, so that no distinction is really made. And this is one of the slipperiest elements of these propaganda films. In the film I Accuse, this was seen by 15 million people, and it was directed actually by one of the most outstanding German filmmakers, Wolfgang Liebenheiner. And the central character is a woman pianist who's struck down with multiple sclerosis. Now, you see her appealing to her doctor to kill her, arguing that she's no longer a person, but rather a lump of flesh. And when her doctor refuses, her husband takes her life himself. Then he's shown in court where he's asked about the murder, and he says, "The reason I did it is that I loved her." And of course, the narrative of the film clearly is trying to convince audiences that courts need to be much more flexible in allowing a loving husband to put his wife to death when she's suffering so much. And I think that this kind of propaganda was insidious. And if you look at all of these films together, here's the recurrent theme. Those who have serious mental illness or incurable physical diseases really are violating the laws of nature, and they would certainly die if left to natural forces. And we can just only speculate about the impact the films had on the citizens of Nazi Germany, but we know that there are hundreds of physicians that willingly participated in the euthanasia inherent in genocide. If we turn now to more contemporary films, I think that one of the things that we have to recognize is euthanasia tends to be valorized in contemporary Hollywood and European cinema. This has quite a long history. I mean, in my research, I found a film in 1948 called An Act of Murder, where a judge, played by Frederick March, faces a trial in court after he chooses to kill his terminally ill wife, much like I accuse. And then in the 1970s, Dalton Trumbo made a very well-known book, Johnny Got His Gun, into an anti-war film. And this features a brutally mutilated war veteran who requests euthanasia. When it's denied to him, the doctors and nurses are seen as being barbaric. Now, if you haven't seen Johnny Got His Gun, I strongly recommend that you maintain your position of not seeing it, because if it's on your Netflix list, you should discard it. It's a terrible film, actually. The only thing that's of moderate interest in it is that Donald Sutherland plays Jesus Christ in a bathrobe and does card tricks, which is a rather novel portrayal of Christ. But other than that, I don't think it has any redeeming features. So what I'm saying is don't rent that film just because you heard about it here. The same is true of another film that came out of the 1970s. This is Soylent Green. Most people only know about this because on Saturday Night Live, Phil Hartman did a dead-on impersonation of Charlton Heston in Soylent Green, and that's probably the only claim to fame it has. But this is a film that shows a futuristic society where the state sponsors a kind of compassionate euthanasia for elderly citizens who can choose to go to a local facility and opt for a beautiful, idyllic multimedia presentation as they're put to sleep. It was actually Edward G. Robinson's last film. And if we look at some of these popular films, here's what you see again and again. Euthanasia is a compassionate, rational choice. It's made by the patient alone without coercion from anybody. And it's usually opposed by insensitive, misinformed, and unenlightened mainstream institutions like the courts, the Catholic Church, medicine, psychiatry. Now, let me show you this next slide here. Here are some films from 1970 to 2006 that depict some version of a euthanasia theme, sometimes quite as a central point of the plot. And, when I did research on this, I was rather surprised to see how many films about euthanasia were big box office hits and Academy Award winners. Just to give you a sample of this, The English Patient won Best Picture. The $1 Million Baby won the Oscar for Best Picture. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won the Oscar for Best Picture. The Sea Inside won Best Foreign Film in 2004. Barbarian Invasions won Best Foreign Film in 2003. And these are terrific films, but most of them pivot around an act of euthanasia, indicating that in some way filmmakers are obsessed with this idea, and they must be reflecting something in the culture. Now, what we would say, psychoanalytically speaking, is that successful films are always tapping into unconscious wishes, fears, anxieties in the mass audience. That's one of the reasons people go to the movie theater, not just to be entertained. And we somehow master shared and universal anxieties. If you think, for example, in the classic horror films, what's going on is you see some of your worst childhood anxieties depicted on the screen, and then it happens to someone else once removed from you, and you survive it. And as in most of these films, somebody says, I think I'll go walk down that dark corridor by myself to see if the monster's down there, and everyone says, good idea, why don't you go down there? So, somebody walks down there and they get killed by the monster, and one by one you're seeing all these people getting killed, and you're sitting in the audience thinking, well, they're pretty stupid to go down that hall, I wouldn't do that, and you feel some reassurance that you've mastered this and survived it. Now, the other thing that I want to state here is that, and I mentioned this earlier, that cinema is really mythopoetic. When we see films, they're creating myths, and these myths help us through all of the existential angst and dread that is involved in living. And I'm using a certain type of definition of myths, the one that Levi-Strauss uses. Myths are transformations of fundamental conflicts or contradictions that in reality can't be resolved. So there are certain anxieties we have about death, about dying, about how to deal with aging or terminal illness. And mercy killing then becomes a simple, obvious, uncomplicated solution to suffering, pain, family anguish, and the fear of the great unknown. And what I'd like to do is show you a few clips of more contemporary films where it's basically a simple choice and a rational choice. One of the films that I thought was particularly well done was Richard Dreyfuss starred in Whose Life Is It Anyway? And for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a film where he's a sculptor. He gets in a serious auto accident, becomes quadriplegic, and then he lies in a hospital bed for most of the film, realizing he can never sculpt again, he can never make love again, and he chooses to die. Now, all of the doctors are portrayed as very conservative and thinking this is an awful thing to do, and they finally bring it to a kind of makeshift court within the hospital. And you'll see in this scene near the end that the judge, played by the character actor Ken McMillan, says he's satisfied that this quadriplegic patient is not suffering from depression, and he's able to make a decision that must be respected. I'll show you this clip.
Will everyone please return to your seats?
There are precedents aplenty for both sides of this issue. In Reeve, Karen Ann Quinlan, the Supreme Court of New Jersey recognized the preservation of a personal right to privacy against bodily intrusions. In Belchertown versus Salkowitz, the court held that the right to refuse medical treatment in appropriate circumstances extends to both competent and incompetent persons. And the law holds that a deliberate decision to embark on an action which will eventually lead to death is not ipso facto evidence of insanity. If it were, society would have to condemn many men to dishonorable burial rather than posthumous medals. Yet, we do have to remember Mr. Harrison's mind is affected. And we must, in this case, be most careful not to allow Mr. Harrison's intelligence to blind us to the fact that he may be suffering from a depressive illness, which would diminish his ability to make an informed decision. We must ignore Mr. Harrison's cogently argued plea to be allowed to die if we believe it to be the product of a disturbed or clinically depressed mind. However, I am satisfied that Mr. Harrison is a brave and thoughtful man who is in complete possession of his mental faculties, and I therefore order that he be set free. That's it, gentlemen. Peggy, you want to get that? Hey, you got your hanging, Judge.
I think not. Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
I hope so.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Now, this film, like many others, generates a particular view about the terminally ill or chronically disabled patients. In essence, the view is most of them wish to die as we would if we were in that situation, and therefore the audience is very sympathetic. Now, research suggests that's not actually true. In a classic study that Chochinov did, they looked at the desire for death in a group of 100 cancer patients who were terminally ill. Only 8.5% actually harbored a clinically significant desire for death. And of that group, 59% met the criteria for major depression. Now, another study, which Breitbait et al. Did in 1996, looked at 300 men with AIDS, back in a time when AIDS was much more of a death sentence than it is now. There was no association between severity of illness and the wish to die. Now, one of the things that some of the intelligent observers about the whole issue of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide have noted is there's something called pseudo-empathy. And doctors who treat terminally ill patients may have this pseudo-empathy. It's basically a view that, well, it's normal to want to die if you have this condition. And this is based on an assumption that it's the way they would feel if they were in a similar situation. Now, that's, again, not something you can automatically assume. There are two different subjectivities in the room. One's patient, one's doctor. They have two different experiences. And because of this, the concern is that someone who's clinically depressed may not actually be adequately diagnosed and may go untreated. Now, the quadriplegic patient, in whose life is in any way, has shown making this decision to deny any form of heroic treatment. And the judge at the end says this isn't out of depression, and the judge has taken a psychiatrist's word in this film that, you know, he's not depressed. Now, one of the things that struck me as I watched this film, they don't take into account the accident is relatively recent. The patient may be in a state of grief about losing his functioning and his faculties, and in fact, in time, the patient may change his view about his wish to die. In fact, in Chochinov's study, half of the terminally ill cancer patients who wanted to die changed their minds in a 2-month period. Now, I want to show you two of the most romanticized depictions of mercy killing. And they're in two excellent foreign films. Both of them, as I mentioned, won Best Picture Oscars for foreign films. And the first is The Barbarian Invasions, a 2003 film. And this was made by the French film maker Denis Arcand. And in the film, there's a man about 60 years old named Remy, played by Remy Girard. He's divorced, he's in the hospital with cancer, and his son, Sebastian is going to help him die. And this is very moving because they've been estranged, father and son. The son comes back, rises to the occasion, does whatever he can to ease his father into death. And I'm going to show you a tear-jerking scene here at the end where on the day when the mercy killing is going to take place, the son comes to say goodbye to his father, and what's depicted is that the son's willingness to participate in the euthanasia is the ultimate act of love for his dad.
Je sais pas. On fait ce que tu veux. C'est toi qui décides. C'est ce que je te souhaite. D'avoir un fils aussi bien que toi. Sylvain, hein? Non. Tu lui diras que je pense à elle. Je t'aime.
Now, what I'd like to do now is show you a clip from another moving film, and you know this is a tear-jerking scene, and many of these films are. The next one is from The Sea Inside. It's a 2004 film, a Spanish film made by Alejandro Amenábar, and in this clip, you'll see Javier Bardem, who's a superb actor, playing a quadriplegic, much like Whose Life Is It Anyway, and he's become quadriplegic in a diving accident. And he sees no reason to continue living. He lies in his bed, has fantasies of flying. At one point, it's not on the clip, but he tells his girlfriend, "The one who loves you is the one who kills you." And finally, they're shown lovingly kissing at the end of the film, and they're watching the sunset prior to his death.
Y les dije lo de las vistas. ¿Te gusta?
¿Dónde hay que firmar?
¿Para qué?
Para casarse contigo. Se quedó frito. Claro, como no me muevo.
Ramón, si es verdad que hay vida después de la muerte. Ya sé que te va a parecer una tontería, ¿no? Pero, por favor, mándame una señal.
¿Una señal?
Lo que sea. Yo nunca le tuve miedo a los espíritus. Estaré muy atenta, esperando. ¿Lo harás?
Claro que sí. Lo que pasa es que entre tú y yo Yo creo que después de morirnos, no hay nada. Es igual que antes de nacer. Nada.
¿Y cómo estás tan seguro, Ramón? Eso no lo sabe nadie.
No estoy seguro, claro que no. Pasa que es un pálpito. Es como cuando mi padre mira al cielo y dice, mañana va a llover. Y llueve. Es un presentimiento. Pero no olvides una cosa. Yo voy a estar en tus sueños. Voy a venir por la noche a tu cama y vamos a hacer el amor. Y por si no te lo digo en tus sueños, te lo digo ahora. Gracias, Rosa. De todo corazón. Gracias.
Now you can see how moving these scenes are. Your eyes tear up, the music swells in the background and makes it even more emotional. And there's this ambience of love, that this is the most loving thing that anyone could do for a romantic partner or a family member. Now, here's what's disconcerting. I'm going to show you a clip of the 1941 film I mentioned earlier, I Accuse. And there's a chilling similarity to some of the ways that mercy killing is portrayed in the Nazi films and these more modern films. Now, remember, this is the one where the wife has multiple sclerosis and the husband and she are saying goodbye to each other here before he puts her to sleep. And you'll find that the words, the whole ambience is remarkably similar to what you've just seen.
Wünschte, es wäre der Tod. Es ist der Tod.
Eventually, Hyde, who has failed to find a cure, overdoses his desperate wife.
Ich dich liebe, Thomas. Ich wünschte, ich könnte dir die Hand geben.
Ich liebe dich. Hannah.
Ich liebe dich, Thomas.
You see what I mean? And, you know, this is what I was saying earlier, that what happens in these films is a blurring of the distinction between voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. And there's this assumption that anyone in a debilitated state like this would obviously want to die, and it's very humane to put them to death. The other thing that is very significant here is none of these films show even a hint of coercion by the family members. It's seen as something that's entirely the choice of the disabled person and an unambivalent decision that they're absolutely certain about. One of the things that I've been interested in for years is the Netherlands experience. Back in the 90s, I was in some American Psychiatric Association symposia with the Dutch psychiatrists who were starting to experiment with euthanasia. What they told me is that they were finding there are subtle or not so subtle coercions that go on between the family of the patient and the terminal patient himself. And at times, they would witness outright pressure brought to bear by family members the family members would be saying, is life really worth living? Are you really getting any quality of life at this point? And obviously, the coercion can influence a decision at any point in the process. Now, what the Dutch psychiatrist told me is it can affect when a patient requests the overdose, whether or not the overdose is actually taken, and how long the patient chooses to live between making the request and overdosing. Now, often they would find out retrospectively that the family coercion took place outside of the doctor's awareness, so that there wasn't any way the doctor could really address it. Now, in one case in the Netherlands, a wife who no longer wished to care for her elderly and dying husband gave him a choice. You can have euthanasia or you can go to a nursing home. It sounds humorous, but this actually happened. And the husband was basically afraid that he'd be left with strangers in an unfamiliar environment, and he chose euthanasia. In another case from the Netherlands, the doctors interviewed a man with Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and his wife was present. The doctor asked the patient, do you want to go ahead with euthanasia? The patient, began weeping. The wife quickly answered for him and said to the doctor, yes, he wants to have euthanasia. He preferred to cry alone. Could you please leave the room? So, he repeatedly pushed the date back, but the doctor went ahead and proceeded to implement euthanasia before actually hearing the patient say, this is what I want. His wife kept speaking for him. So these are the kinds of abuses that worried the Dutch psychiatrists. And Cherney et al., who studied this phenomenon, coined a term, empathic distress, and what they're describing is how dying patients may actually recognize that they're becoming a huge burden on the family. They look in the family's eyes and they think, I don't want to do this to my family anymore. I should probably just, end it all. And they can also see that in the eyes of nurses and doctors, hospice workers. And this often compounds their own distress because they're feeling like they're a huge burden. Now, this sense of family fatigue can lead patients to request assisted death because they're being considerate of their loved ones. So this idea in the film, of course, is that there is a pure, unambivalent decision made by the patient. This doesn't actually mirror reality in many cases because there are complex family dynamics, and this is something you just don't see. Now, the view that the patient himself decides on assisted suicide also overlooks how influential physicians can be. One of the eminent ethicists, Pellegrino, has argued that we shouldn't have physician-assisted suicide because it does imply from the name that this is something the patient decides. He says, in fact, the provision of means, the clinical evaluation are in the hands of doctor. And the other thing that we would say is that there are countertransference problems in the physicians who confront this. Physicians as a group have a certain kind of psychology about death. Many physicians go into the field because they have the fantasy of out-wrestling the angel of death, defying the grim reaper, and they're going to somehow cure the incurable and rescue people from the jaws of death. Now, Herbert Hendon, who's former president of the American Suicide Foundation, said that a lot of physicians feel overwhelmed, powerless, helpless in this situation, and they may help the patient make the decision because of that. And most physicians want to harbor this illusion of mastery over disease, and then this kind of a patient takes that away from them. So we can't assume that the physician's a totally rational person in this kind of a decision-making process. In one of our American Psychiatric Association symposia on this subject, we had two colleagues from Australia join us, and they had another experience that I thought was quite informative. You may know in 1995, the Northern Territory enacted the first law in the world where a doctor could give a lethal injection to a patient. Now later, the federal parliament overturned it, but not until 4 patients had their lives terminated. And it was all by the same doctor. And the colleagues from Australia pointed out this guy was a zealot. He was passionately behind physician-assisted suicide, like Dr. Kevorkian in this country. And he was the guy who was making these decisions with unequivocal certainty. This is definitely a good idea with very little workup of the patient. And everyone became alarmed at what rapidly happened when the Northern Territory had tried to toy with this idea. So what the Australian colleagues observed is the physician just takes the request for physician-assisted suicide at face value. Oh, you want to die? Fine. Okay, we'll arrange it tomorrow. And the studies indicate that this is often like a request that's complicated. It can be a plea for help, or maybe a hope that the doctor will say, no, you shouldn't give up. There's a reason to live, and maybe the doctor will provide some reason to live. And sometimes this is not explored at all. Now, let me show you another film, a more recent one, One True Thing. Carl Franklin directed this. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Meryl Streep, as usual, turns in a moving performance as Kate Golden. And she's a saintly mother who bravely faces her terminal cancer. She has a philandering, no-good husband, played by William Hurt, who kind of distances himself from her as she's dying. And she has a daughter, Ellen, played by Renee Zellweger, who's been kind of estranged, a career woman, and kind of comes back from New York out into the sticks to take care of her mom. And at one point in the film, you see the mom desperately pleading for the daughter, Ellen, to sort of help her end her life. Now, after the film, after the death, the very end of the film, I'm going to show you this. There's a very moving cemetery scene where they've buried her, and father and daughter are astonished to find out that neither of them actually assisted the protagonist, Meryl Streep, with her death, that she did it herself. So let me show you the scene.
Ellen, I just want you to know how much I admire your courage. I wish I'd done it.
Huh?
I wish I had. I would have. Couldn't.
Dad, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I thought that... all this time I've thought that it was you. Oh my God.
It's impossible.
Oh my God.
She was too helpless. She was too frail. The pills. How could she? Jesus. Ellen, I love your mother. I don't suppose I'm ever going to stop loving her. But because she could do anything, run the house, run our lives, keep everything so beautiful and so warm, thought of what she meant to me. My muse, my lovely wife, my one true thing.
Of course, she did it. Who else would have had the strength?
No, you have to go deeper than that. You have to go 4 inches.
4?
Yeah. Yeah, so that they don't rot in the snow, or so that the animals don't get them. And then 4 inches apart so that the roots don't tangle and they'll just look prettier.
Now, in One True Thing, like some of these other films, the idea is it was clearly a heroic act that Mom did there. And the William Hurt character says, you know, only she would have the strength to do this. And there's no virtue, the film suggests, in tolerating pain or letting nature take its course. And this is the coward's way out. Now, I want to introduce another theme in these films, the outlaw hero. This is a theme that you see in a lot of American films, especially like the films of the Old West. There's a melodramatic conflict between an outlaw hero and an official hero. The outlaw hero is always reluctant. He's on the fringes of society. He struggles with conflicts that approximate but eventually replace larger political questions. The film scholar Robert Ray said, the self-determining, morally detached outlaw hero came to represent America itself. A good example would be like the Casablanca, the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca, plus numerous films in which the kind of bad boy outlaw turns out to really be the savior, the guy who's going to save the day, but nobody recognizes the value of this person. Now, in the film $1 Million Baby, we see a great example of this. Clint Eastwood is the star, as you know, and he plays Frankie Dunn. And he's a guy who's training boxers all his life and suffering guilt over his estranged daughter. And he trains Hilary Swank in the role of Maggie Fitzgerald to boxing fame. And then after assisting her to be the best female boxer in the world, he watches Maggie's arch nemesis break her neck in the ring with an illegal maneuver. So then she has a spine injury and she's confined to bed. She lets him know she no longer wishes to live. And Frankie is racked with guilt and anxiety about what to do. And in the scene I'm going to show you, he visits his priest. This is a kind of hard-boiled, foul-mouthed priest played by Brian O'Byrne. And the priest makes it clear that no matter how many sins he's committed, the worst possible thing would be to end Maggie's life. So let me show you.
You can't do it. You know that.
I do, Father. But you don't know how thick she is, how hard it was to train her. Other fighters would do exactly what you say to them, and she'd ask why this and why that, and do it her own way anyway. How she fought for the title, it wasn't by anything. It wasn't by listening to me. But now she wants to die. And I just want to keep her with me. And I swear to God, Father, it's It's committing a sin by doing it. By keeping her alive, I'm killing her. You know what I mean? How do I get around that?
You don't. You step aside, Frankie. You leave her with God.
She's not asking for God's help. She's asking for mine.
Frankie, I've seen you at Mass almost every day for 23 years. The only person who comes to church that much is the kind who can't forgive himself for something. Whatever sins you're carrying, they're nothing compared to this. Forget about God or heaven and hell. If you do this thing, you'll be lost. Somewhere so deep, you'll never find yourself again.
Now, the casting of Clint Eastwood is interesting in this film. You know, he goes ahead and puts some lethal substance into the IV of Maggie and kills her. But one of the things that I recognize as I watch this is Clint Eastwood is the icon of the outlaw hero from the Dirty Harry movies. He was the vigilante who took justice into his own hands when the law failed. And the message in that series of films was you can't trust the opinion of traditional institutions in mainstream society. In the Dirty Harry films, it's the law or justice. In this film, it's the Catholic Church. The priest speaks with great authority, but it's clear to anyone who sees the film the priest is wrong. Now, you see other examples of this. You know, another one I think is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And there's a love for the outlaw hero in these films. And I think what happens is they're always making simple solutions. There are larger social themes, but it gets down to the decisions of a single individual. With all the complexities of euthanasia, here it's simply Clint Eastwood's decision to defy the Catholic Church. And in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there's a moving scene at the end where Jack Nicholson, who has been a psychopath, totally disrupting the treatment in a psychiatric hospital, nevertheless gets the sympathy of the audience because he's the outlaw who's defying the institution, which we all see as a bunch of old fuddy-duddies who are controlling all of the patients. Nurse Ratched is the castrating woman with the castrated men, and she's going to be the boss no matter what. And then at the end, they finally lobotomize the Jack Nicholson character, McMurphy, and the big Indian chief, who's been catatonic until he was successfully treated by the psychopath, McMurphy, he puts the pillow over his head and smothers him at the end as a compassionate act. Now, once again, we see this as a kind of liberation. Not only does the Indian chief kill McMurphy, but we see the Indian chief then escape through the walls of the mental hospital and run into the forest as though the free spirit of the Jack Nicholson character is transmogrified into the chief, and he's escaped. So the audience finds this very satisfying. And another theme I wanted to mention briefly is euthanasia as punishment for one's sins. We see this in the Academy Award-winning film, The English Patient. And here, the Ralph Fiennes character, Count Laszlo de Amalfi, is burned in a plane crash, and he's living with tremendous guilt because the woman he loved was left in a cave to die. Now, he can't move her because of severe fractures, and he tries to go get help, and she's dead by the time that he finally arranges the help. And there's a beautiful scene near the end where he talks to his nurse, played by Juliette Binoche, and he gets her to overdose him with opiates. And he says, "Thank you," as it ends. And I'm not going to show you the clip because of the time getting short, but it's a very moving scene again where he feels he deserves to be euthanized because of what he's done. Now, the other side of the story on all these films is relatively scant. You don't see too many films that raise questions about the practice of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. But it's surprising that when you look hard enough, you find a kind of light romantic comedy is taking that position. And I'm speaking of Mark Waters' Just Like Heaven, the 2005 film. And just to give you some of the backstory, Reese Witherspoon plays a workaholic medical resident who gets injured in a crash and lapses into a deep coma. Now, a struggling artist, David Abbott, played by Mark Ruffalo, moves into her San Francisco apartment because they assume, well, she's gone, she's in coma, so they let him rent the apartment, and then suddenly he sees the spirit of Reese Witherspoon in the apartment, and he puts his hand right through her because she's like a ghost, suggesting that, well, the body is lying in a coma, but the spirit is out, going back to her apartment. Now, there's an intriguing scene I'm going to show you in which the doctor in charge of her case is emphasizing that she signed an advance directive that she didn't want to have her life continued on life support. And then the Reese Witherspoon's character's sister is brought in, and the doctor is trying to say, well, we need to pull the plug now. But Reese Witherspoon is there, again, as a spirit, so they can't see her, but she's arguing, wait a minute, I don't feel that way anymore, and I don't want the plug to be pulled, and you'll see the scene.
Well, this is hard to say. When we come to work here, we are asked to sign release forms.
Okay. I don't like the sound of this.
Did you know your sister's opinion about artificially prolonging life?
No.
She was against it.
Really?
Okay, that was before. I am completely for it now.
Honestly, most in our profession feel that way.
Not me. I'm perfectly happy. Come on, Abby. You've got to feel me. I'm your sister.
But there's still some brain activity, isn't there? I mean, people have woken up from this kind of coma before.
All the time.
Not on any record I've found.
Of course they have. Otherwise, what am I doing here? I feel car sick.
What are you doing?
We're looking for the stick.
What stick?
You always said she had a stick up her...
Stop it! Come on. TV is going to become a very dim memory for you two.
Mrs. Brody, Elizabeth did sign a release, but because of the special situation, we won't take any terminal action without your explicit approval. Now, I've prepared this paperwork.
Abby, don't sign that.
Which
I'm
if
here.
you decide to sign.
I'll think about it.
Abby, I'll babysit more. I swear. And those jeans you love, they're yours.
I sometimes find that it's easier just to ask God's forgiveness and not prolong the inevitable.
I said I'd think about it.
Thank you, Abby. You always looked out for me.
And of course, as you can imagine, she is actually able to recover from the coma, and she and Mark Ruffalo live happily ever after, like in any fairy tale. So it was shown to be very unwise to take the patient's idea that an advance directive should be carried out. Now, there's actually a little bit of data about this I mentioned earlier. Some patients do change their minds with the passage of time, as was depicted in that clip. And the desire for death is basically unstable temporally. So you can't automatically assume this is going to stay the same as though it's a once and for all decision. Let me just finish up now with a few more comments and we'll have some discussion. First of all, we must keep in mind that cinema is providing an alternative reality for audience members. Remember, these are mythic solutions to extraordinarily complicated dilemmas, meaning they're oversimplified and straightforward. And, you know, the patient always passes into a painless sleep in the films, but you don't see the complications. Like in Oregon, you know, they've had cases where there's vomiting that goes on and on and on, and the person's miserable. There are cases of a lag of several hours between the time the drug is administered and the patient dies. And in one well-documented case, a patient took the overdose, lost consciousness in 25 minutes, then regained consciousness 65 hours later. So these are, you know, messier than they appear in film, and that's my point about the way film is. There's a slippery slope that occurs when a society starts to endorse euthanasia as a sanctioned means of dealing with terminal illness. And like the Nazi films suggest, it's a relatively small step to eugenics and some kind of playing of God about who should live, who should die, and whose choice should be accepted at face value. Now, in the Netherlands, the slippery slope has now led to debates about whether children who are born with serious defects, like in the black stork, should be, you know, allowed to live or just allowed to die shortly after birth. And they're now debating this at the highest levels of that country. I think there's probably a basic reason that we're fascinated with these films about euthanasia. Just like with the horror films, they give us some sense of mastery, an illusion of mastery over death. And one final comment is they probably are displacing the horror of death and the existential uncertainty about that onto the means of dying. And this then provides some reassurance to the audience that somehow we have control over this and we don't have to just face the uncertainty of the great unknown. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll open it for questions.